Um, when we settled on the title of this talk, few people could have realized how apt it would be when the time came. That is, how dramatically the world would be changing, how far-reaching are the implications for domestic and world order. I'm referring, of course, to the democracy uprising in the Arab world. It's been quite a spectacular display of courage, dedication, and commitment by popular forces, and it happened to coincide fortuitously with a remarkable uprising of tens of thousands of people in support of working people and democracy in Madison, Wisconsin, and a number of other U.S. cities still continuing. One very telling event took place on February 20th, in the middle of both of these uprisings. Kamal Abbas is a labor leader, one of the major labor leaders in Egypt, sent a message from Tahrir Square to Wisconsin in the name of the Egyptian labor organizations. It said simply, "We stand with you as you stood with us." Well, as I said, Abbas is a leader of the many years of struggle in Egypt for elementary rights. This uprising on January 25th didn't come out of nowhere. There's a significant background. Actually, the background is worth thinking about. As I'm sure you know, the January 25th uprising was initiated by a small group of tech-savvy young people who call themselves the April 6th movement. The reason for the name is that in April 6th, 2008, there was a major labor action prepared at one of the biggest industrial sites in Egypt, the Mahala textile plant. It's to be a strike for better wages, decent working conditions, and so on. And it was to be in connection with a large solidarity actions. All of that was crushed right away by the dictatorship. Didn't have any resonance in the West, but remembered in Egypt. So that's the April 6th demonstration, non-demonstration, the name of the movement that started the January 25th uprising with its remarkable consequences. Abbas's measure of solidarity evoked the traditional aspiration of the labor movements throughout the world, solidarity among workers of the world and in general among populations of the world. Well, however flawed their records may be, labor movements have regularly been in the forefront of popular struggles for basic rights and for democracy. In Tahrir Square in Cairo, in the streets of Madison, and many other places, the popular struggles that are underway now reach quite directly to the prospects for authentic democracy, that is, for socio-political systems in which people are free and equal participants in controlling the institutions in which they live and work. That's contrary to standard democratic theory, which holds that people should be spectators, not participants, leave the important things to others. Right now, the trajectories in Cairo and Madison are intersecting, but they're headed in opposite directions. In Cairo, they're heading towards gaining elementary rights that were denied by the US-backed, British-backed dictatorships. In Madison, they're directed towards defending rights that had been won in long and hard struggles, now under severe attack. And in fact, the fundamental right of collective bargaining has just been eliminated by the governor in the legislature in Madison. There are sure to be far-reaching consequences of what is taking place in the decaying industrial heartland of the richest and most powerful country in the world, in fact in human history, and what is taking place in what President Eisenhower many years ago called the most strategically important area in the world, a stupendous source of strategic power, probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment. Those are the assessments of the State Department, U.S. State Department in the 1940s, and of course that was a prize that the U.S. intended to keep for itself and for its allies in the unfolding world order of that day. Well, despite all the changes since, there's every reason to suppose that today's policymakers are still guided by a judgment that was articulated by one of President Roosevelt's leading advisors, A. Burley, who observed that control of the incomparable energy reserves of the Middle East would yield substantial control of the world. And correspondingly, that loss of control would threaten the project of global dominance that was clearly articulated during World War II, that has been sustained in the face of major changes in world order since that day, and that is very much alive today. You can be confident that in the major planning centers of the United States, Britain, France, other countries with some intent on global reach, they're very much concerned that the loss of control of the energy reserves of the Middle East will undermine the prospects for control of the world, and are acting accordingly. You'll have noticed, I'm sure, that the closer demonstrations come to the U.S., British-dominated oil-producing centers, the harder, the lower the prospects for demonstrations. Yesterday in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the major centers, the demonstrations were crushed before they started. You could give some lessons to China. In Riyadh, not a single person showed up, too frightened, and no comment from the West. I checked the U.S. newspapers this morning, no comment. If it had happened in Iran, there'd be major headlines, you can be sure. But too much is at stake when you get to the real centers of power. In fact, President Obama has changed the rhetoric, the official rhetoric, with regard to democracy uprisings as they come close to significant areas. Actually, he and other Western leaders did not support the uprisings. In fact, the only political leader to support the uprisings strongly and immediately was Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey, who's by far the most respected leader in the area. The others waited, and when it was clear that you couldn't preserve your favorite dictators anymore, they followed the usual game plan and send them out to pasture and try to maintain the regime. And they did use words like regime change at the end. But as it gets to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the terminology changed officially to regime alteration. So maybe some slight modification, but no change in the regime. As I say, in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, nothing. Too much of a police presence. Bahrain is particularly significant for two reasons. One reason, it hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the major military force in the region. The other, which is even more significant, is that Bahrain has it's a Sunni dictatorship, but it has a majority Shiite population, and it's right across the causeway from Saudi Arabia, eastern Saudi Arabia, which is largely Shiite, and where most of the oil is. There's a kind of an accident of history and geography which has placed the bulk of the world's energy reserves at the northern end of the Persian Gulf, that region right there, which is overwhelmingly Shiite. And there's been a deep concern in planning sectors for a long time that there might end up being some kind of a Shiite alliance, independent of the West, which would control most of the world's oil. And that's why demonstrations in Bahrain are regarded as so sensitive. No calls for regime change there, certainly not Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Well, from the outset of the Second World War in 1939, Washington anticipated that the war would end with the United States in a position of overwhelming power. High-level State Department officials, foreign policy specialists, met in a group called the War Peace Studies Group right through the wartime years to lay out plans for the post-war world. The core notion was what they called a grand area that the U.S. was to dominate in the post-war world. That included, at a minimum, the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire Far East, and the former British Empire, which the U.S. was going to take over. That includes its Middle East energy resources. The British, I should say, were not entirely happy about this. There was actually a kind of a mini-war going on during the Second World War between the United States and Britain over who would control Saudi Arabia, the kind of jewel in the crown. Of course, the U.S. won the conflict. President Roosevelt declared Saudi Arabia vital for the defense of democracy and freedom. That allowed it to get Lend-Lease aid to sort of push the British aside and make sure the right people took it over. The British Foreign Office recognized ruefully that from now on the best they can hope for is to be junior partners of, that's their phrase, of the master. And so it's remained since. That's called a special relationship, technically. Well, that was the plan for the post-war world in the early years. It was assumed then that Germany would remain as a dominant European power. But as Russia began to grind down the Nazi armies after Stalingrad, grand area planning changed. The goals extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible. At the very least, its economic core in Western Europe. Within the grand area, I'm now quoting, the U.S. was to maintain unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy while ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its global designs. The words are worth remembering. They still apply. These careful wartime plans were very soon implemented. It was always recognized from the very beginning that Europe might choose to follow an independent course. It's capable of doing that. NATO was established in part, partially intended to counter that threat. It's interesting to see what happened as soon as the official pretext for NATO ended in 1989. Anyone who believed 50 years of propaganda would have concluded, okay, NATO will disappear. It was there to save Western Europe from the Russian hordes. Okay, no more Russian hordes, no more NATO. Not exactly what happened. Rather, NATO was expanded immediately. It was expanded to the east in violation from verbal pledges to Gorbachev, which he was naive enough to believe. Since then, it's been extended even